The morning sun had barely peeked through the city's tall buildings when a young boy trudged up the steps of the number 47 bus. His backpack felt extra heavy that day, stuffed with textbooks and his science project that was due first period. Dark circles under his eyes showed he'd stayed up late studying for his math test, but there was a gentle determination in his steps. The bus was more crowded than usual. The air conditioning was struggling against the early autumn heat, and the windows were foggy with condensation. The boy had walked an extra 30 minutes just to catch this bus, since they'd cut the route near his neighborhood. His grandmother had offered to drive him, but he knew her car was making funny noises again, and the repair shop was expensive. Finding an empty seat near the middle, he slid in gratefully, pulling out his flashcards for one last review. The bus lurched forward, and he swayed with its familiar motion, the same way he had every morning for the past 3 months. He'd gotten used to this longer route, using the time to study or sometimes just watch the city wake up through the fingerprint-smudged windows. At the next stop, several more passengers squeezed on. Among them was a pregnant woman, one hand resting on her belly, the other gripping the overhead rail. She was breathing heavily, clearly uncomfortable in the packed space. The boy watched as several adults pretended not to notice her, their faces buried in their phones or newspapers. Without thinking twice, he stuffed his flashcards back into his pocket. His grandmother's words echoed in his head. Sometimes the right thing and the hard thing are the same thing. Standing up, he caught the woman's eye and gestured to his now empty seat. "Please, you can sit here," he said, his voice quiet but clear. The surprise and gratitude in her eyes made him stand a little straighter. She thanked him warmly as she settled into the seat, sighing with relief. "You're such a thoughtful young man," she said, looking up at him. "How long have you been taking this route?" As the bus continued its journey through the busy streets, they struck up a conversation. He told her about his school, his dream of becoming a doctor, and how he didn't mind the extra walking since it gave him time to think. She listened intently, not with the dismissive half-attention adults often gave kids, but with genuine interest. When she asked why he chose this particular route, he explained about the budget cuts that had canceled the buses in his neighborhood. He didn't mention how his grandmother worked 2 jobs, or how he missed having breakfast with her in the mornings, or how sometimes his feet hurt from the extra walking. Instead, he talked about how he liked seeing the city wake up, how he discovered a little bakery that filled the street with the smell of fresh bread every morning, and how he'd made friends with the crossing guard who always had a joke ready. Other passengers started listening in, some smiling behind their phones, others nodding approvingly. For a moment, the usual morning silence of the bus was broken by something warmer, more human. Even the driver glanced back through his mirror, a small smile playing on his lips. The boy didn't know it yet, but this simple morning choice would set in motion events that would change not just his life, but the lives of many others in ways he couldn't imagine. For now, though, he was just a kid, standing on a crowded bus, holding onto a swaying handrail, and thinking about his upcoming math test. The pregnant woman shifted in her seat, finally able to rest her tired feet. She'd been standing in line at the doctor's office all morning, and her back was killing her. Looking up at the young boy who'd given her his seat, she noticed how his uniform was slightly too big for him, probably meant to be grown into, but it was spotlessly clean and carefully pressed. The bus hit a pothole, making everyone sway. The boy grabbed the handrail tighter, nearly dropping his worn backpack. A math worksheet peeked out from the side pocket, covered in neat handwriting and gold star stickers. His eyes kept drifting to it, clearly worried about the test ahead, but he didn't complain about having to stand. "Which school do you go to?" she asked, genuinely curious about this young man who seemed so different from many kids his age. When he told her, her eyes widened slightly. That was clear across town. No wonder he had to take this route. The school was known for its excellent science program, and she could see why an aspiring doctor would want to go there. Other passengers were now openly watching their interaction, some with small smiles, others with a hint of shame for not offering their own seats. A businessman in an expensive suit shifted uncomfortably, suddenly very interested in his shoelaces. An elderly lady in the corner nodded approvingly, reminding her of times when such courtesy was more common. The pregnant woman noticed a small tear in the boy's backpack that had been carefully sewn up. She recognized the kind of stitching, the same kind her mother used to do when money was tight and new things weren't an option. Despite this, the boy carried himself with quiet dignity, no trace of self-pity or resentment in his manner. As they talked, she learned more about his daily routine. He woke up at 5:30 every morning to help his grandmother with her medication before heading out. He packed his own lunch, usually a simple sandwich and whatever fruit was on sale that week. There was something special about how he spoke about his grandmother, like she was his personal superhero. The conversation turned to his dreams of becoming a doctor. His eyes lit up as he described how he'd been reading medical books from the library, how he even learned to take blood pressure readings to help monitor his grandmother's health. It wasn't the kind of dream that came from watching TV shows about rich doctors in fancy hospitals. It came from a genuine desire to help people. Other passengers began chiming in. The elderly lady mentioned her grandson was in medical school. A nurse on her way to her shift offered some advice about medical programs. For a few precious minutes, the usually quiet bus turned into a community of people sharing stories and encouragement. The pregnant woman felt her baby kick, as if joining in the conversation. She placed a hand on her belly, thinking about what kind of world her child would grow up in. Meeting this young boy gave her hope. There were still people who cared, who helped others without expecting anything in return. As the bus approached her stop, she reached into her purse for a business card. Her husband's company was always looking for bright young minds to mentor, and something told her this boy was special. But before she could pull it out, the bus jerked to a stop, and the card slipped deeper into her bag. The moment passed, and she had to hurry to get off, managing only a heartfelt thank you as she left. Little did she know, she'd be telling this story to her husband that evening. A story that would set much bigger things in motion. For now, she walked away from the bus stop, one hand on her belly, thinking about the young boy who'd reminded her that kindness was still alive in the city. The conversation on the bus that morning was unlike any the young boy had experienced during his daily commute. The pregnant woman had a way of asking questions that made him feel like his answers really mattered. It wasn't the usual grown-up talk where they just nod and smile without really listening. Standing there, swaying with the bus's movement, he found himself sharing things he usually kept to himself. He told her about the old bus route that used to pass right by his house, how its cancellation meant he now had to wake up an hour earlier each day. But instead of complaining, he described how he turned the extra walking time into an adventure. "I found all these shortcuts through the neighborhood," he explained, his eyes brightening. "There's this one alley where a bunch of cats live. I save a bit of my lunch for them sometimes." He didn't mention that sometimes he went hungry himself, making sure the cats got their share. The pregnant woman listened intently as he described his typical day. He'd help his grandmother with her morning routine, make sure she took her pills, and then head out while she got ready for her first job. His voice filled with pride when he mentioned how his grandmother never missed a day of work, even when her arthritis was acting up. "You want to be a doctor?" she asked, noticing how he knew all the names of his grandmother's medications. "That's a big dream." "Yes, ma'am," he replied, standing a little straighter. "I've been reading everything I can about medicine. The library lets me borrow medical books even though they're in the adult section. The librarian says I'm the only kid who's ever asked to read them." Other passengers were now openly listening to their conversation. A nurse in scrubs spoke up from a few seats away. "You know, when I was your age, I also wanted to be a doctor. Started out just like you, reading everything I could get my hands on." The boy's eyes lit up. "Really? What kind of books did you read first?" For the next few minutes, the nurse shared her journey, recommending books and websites he could check out. An elderly man joined in, mentioning his daughter who was now a pediatrician. The usual morning silence had transformed into a warm exchange of stories and advice. The pregnant woman watched as the boy pulled out a small notebook from his pocket, carefully writing down everything the nurse suggested. His handwriting was neat and precise, showing the same care he probably put into his schoolwork. She noticed how his uniform, though clearly second-hand, was immaculately maintained. The walkings actually helped me save some money too, he continued, tucking the notebook away. I used to spend my lunch money on bus fare, but now I can save it. My grandmother doesn't know. I tell her I eat at school, but really, I'm saving up to buy her a better walking cane. The one she has now squeaks, and I know it bothers her at work. The woman felt her heart squeeze. Here was a young boy, facing his own challenges, yet focusing on making his grandmother's life easier. She wanted to help somehow, to do something that would make a difference in his life. As the bus approached her stop, she reached for her purse, intending to give him her husband's business card. Her husband had always talked about wanting to mentor promising young students. But in the rush of standing up, adjusting her bag, and making her way to the door, the card stayed buried in her purse. She turned back one last time before stepping off the bus, catching a glimpse of the boy already pulling out his study materials. There was something special about him, something that went beyond simple kindness. She knew this wasn't the end of their story, it was just the beginning. That evening, in a luxurious penthouse apartment overlooking the city, the pregnant woman couldn't stop thinking about the young boy from the bus. As she sat down to dinner with her husband, the story spilled out between bites of their gourmet meal. "You should have seen him, honey," she said, pushing her plate aside. "He didn't think twice about giving up his seat. And the way he talked about his grandmother." Her voice trailed off as she remembered the boy's worn backpack and carefully mended uniform. Her husband, a self-made tech millionaire, listened intently. He rarely saw his wife this moved by something. As she described the boy's daily routine, the long walk, the early mornings, the dream of becoming a doctor, he found himself thinking about his own childhood. "He walks an extra 30 minutes each way," she continued, "just because they cut the bus route in his neighborhood." But instead of complaining, he talked about how he enjoys watching the sunrise and feeding stray cats along the way. Her husband set down his fork, memories flooding back. "You know, that reminds me of when I was his age," he said quietly. "My mom worked 2 jobs too. I used to walk 3 miles to the library every Saturday because we couldn't afford a computer at home." The couple sat in thoughtful silence for a moment. Through their floor-to-ceiling windows, they could see the city lights twinkling below. Somewhere out there, that young boy was probably helping his grandmother with dinner, or maybe studying by lamplight. "I'd want to find out more about him," her husband decided. Not to interfere, but to help, the right way. He understood the delicate balance between offering support and maintaining dignity. His own success story had taught him that sometimes people just need a door opened. They'll walk through it themselves. He spent the next hour making calls to his contacts in the city's education department. As one of the biggest tech employers in the area, his company had connections everywhere. But he was careful in his questions, not wanting to overstep or make the boy feel singled out. His wife watched him work, one hand resting on her belly. Their own child would be born into privilege, but she wanted them to grow up understanding the value of kindness and hard work, just like the boy on the bus had demonstrated. "Did you get his name?" her husband asked, looking up from his phone. She shook her head regretfully. "Everything happened so fast when I was getting off the bus. But I take that route every Tuesday for my doctor's appointments." He mentioned he rides that bus every day. Her husband nodded, a plan forming in his mind. "Next week, I'll come with you," he decided. Not to make a big show of anything. Just to see for myself. Sometimes, the universe puts people in our path for a reason. As they finished their dinner, they discussed ways they could help that wouldn't feel like charity. Her husband understood from his own experience that pride and self-reliance were precious things, especially when you had little else. Maybe we could start a scholarship program, he suggested, not just for him, but for other kids in similar situations. Make it about merit and character. His fingers drummed thoughtfully on the table, already mapping out the possibilities. His wife smiled, remembering how the boy had brought an entire bus full of strangers together in conversation. Whatever we do, she said, it needs to honor who he is, not just what he needs. As night fell over the city, 2 different households were winding down their days. In one, a wealthy couple planned ways to help a promising young student. In another, a boy and his grandmother sat at their small kitchen table, unaware that their lives were about to change in ways they couldn't imagine. Over the next few days, the wealthy businessman quietly looked into the life of the young boy who had shown such kindness to his wife. His personal assistant made discreet inquiries at the school district office, while his company's community outreach team gathered information about the neighborhood where the boy lived. What they discovered touched his heart even more deeply than his wife's initial story. The boy lived in a small apartment with his grandmother in one of the city's older neighborhoods. Their building wasn't fancy, but neighbors spoke about how the grandmother always kept potted flowers by their door, adding a splash of color to the concrete surroundings. Through careful conversations with school administrators, he learned that the boy was one of their top students. He's never missed a day, the school secretary shared proudly. Even during that big snowstorm last winter, he showed up right on time. She didn't need to mention that this was during the period when the closer bus route was still running. The boy's teachers painted a picture of a quiet but determined student. His science teacher mentioned how he stayed after class to help clean up the lab equipment. The math teacher told them about finding him in the library during lunch breaks, solving extra problems that weren't even assigned. But it was what they learned about his home life that really moved the businessman. After losing his parents in an accident 3 years ago, the boy had stepped up to help his grandmother in ways no child should have to. Yet he did it all without losing his spark, his kindness, or his dreams. His grandmother worked as a housekeeper at a local hotel in the mornings and took evening shifts at a diner. Despite her arthritis, she never complained. Coworkers spoke about how she always carried extra Band-Aids in her pocket for anyone who needed them, and how she remembered everyone's birthday, even though she could barely afford to buy cards. The businessman discovered that the boy volunteered at the community center on weekends, helping younger kids with their homework. The center's director mentioned how he organized a small book club, encouraging other children to read and dream big just like him. Last month, the director shared, he noticed one of the younger kids didn't have a winter coat. The next day, he brought in one of his own old coats that he'd outgrown. That's just who he is. The more they learned, the more the businessman realized this wasn't just about helping one deserving child. It was about recognizing and nurturing the kind of character that made communities stronger. He thought about his own child on the way, hoping they would grow up to have even half the integrity this young boy showed. His team also uncovered the challenges. The grandmother's medical bills were piling up. The apartment building needed repairs. The discontinued bus route had affected not just this family, but dozens of others in the neighborhood, making it harder for people to get to work and school. Sitting in his office, looking at all the information spread across his desk, the businessman felt a deep responsibility. He had the power to help, but he needed to do it in a way that wouldn't hurt their pride or change who they were. Money alone wasn't the answer. It never was. He thought about his own journey from a struggling student to a successful entrepreneur. Someone had seen potential in him once, had opened a door without making him feel like a charity case. Now it was his turn to do the same. Looking out his office window at the city below, he began to form a plan. It would start with meeting the boy himself, seeing firsthand the qualities his wife had described. But it would grow into something bigger, a way to help not just one family, but an entire community. He pulled out his phone to text his wife. "I'll definitely come with you on the bus next week. I think we're about to start something really special. The following Tuesday morning arrived with a light drizzle. The wealthy businessman, dressed in a simple sweater and slacks instead of his usual suit, sat beside his pregnant wife on the bus. It was his first time on public transport in years, and the experience brought back memories of his own humble beginnings. The familiar screech of brakes announced each stop. His wife squeezed his hand gently at the third stop. This was where they'd see the boy. Through the foggy windows, they watched as a small figure climbed aboard, shaking raindrops from his umbrella. The boy looked even younger than his wife had described, but carried himself with quiet confidence. His umbrella, they noticed, was dripping more on one side where a small tear had been patched with tape. As the bus filled up, they watched him scan the crowded space, checking if anyone needed his seat more than he did. An elderly woman with a cane boarded at the next stop. Without hesitation, the boy stood up, offering his seat with a gentle smile. The businessman watched, impressed, as the boy helped steady the woman's shopping bag before it could tip over. Standing next to the handrail, the boy pulled out a textbook. Even from their seats, they could see the pages were well worn, with careful notes written in the margins. He balanced the book against his chest, using every bump and turn of the bus as a chance to adjust his reading position rather than complain about it. The businessman's wife noticed something they hadn't seen last week. The boy had packed an extra sandwich in his lunch bag. At one stop, he quietly handed it to a homeless man who always sat at that corner. The man's face lit up with recognition. Clearly, this was a regular act of kindness. "That sandwich," his wife whispered. "It must be half his lunch." The businessman nodded, thinking about how true generosity often comes from those who have the least to give. They observed how other regular passengers greeted the boy. The bus driver's warm nod, a student's grateful smile as he helped her with her heavy art portfolio, an office worker asking about his grandmother's health. In just a few months, he'd become part of this community of strangers. The businessman thought about all the reports sitting on his desk, the neighborhood statistics, the school records, the community center testimonials. But seeing the boy in person told him more than any paper could. This wasn't just about good grades or perfect attendance. This was about character. He watched as the boy pulled out a small notebook between reading chapters. Inside were carefully written medical terms and their definitions. Even while standing on a moving bus, he was preparing for his future, step by step. The businessman's wife noticed her husband's expression. She knew that look. It was the same one he had years ago, when he'd first dreamed up his company, when he saw potential that others missed. As they approached their stop, the businessman made his decision. He stood up, steadying himself against the bus's movement. His wife watched as he walked toward the boy, not as a wealthy benefactor, but as someone who recognized a kindred spirit. "That's quite a medical dictionary you're building there," he said, nodding at the notebook. The boy looked up, surprised but not shy. His eyes showed curiosity rather than defensiveness, intelligence rather than fear. The conversation that followed was brief, just a few questions about school, about dreams of becoming a doctor, about helping others. But in those few minutes, everything the businessman had learned of the boy proved true. Here was someone who didn't just dream big, but worked hard, stayed kind, and lifted others up along the way. As they stepped off the bus, the businessman turned to his wife. "You were right," he said softly. "He's something special. And I know exactly how we can help. Not just him, but everyone he's been helping too." The next morning, the businessman returned to the bus stop, this time alone. He arrived early, watching the sunrise paint the sky in soft colors, just as the boy had described. The stray cats the boy had mentioned peeked out from behind trash cans, waiting for their regular friend. When the boy arrived, the businessman noticed he was carrying an extra paper bag, probably containing treats for his feline friends. "Those cats sure know who their friend is," the businessman said warmly, breaking the ice. The boy looked up, recognizing him from yesterday. "Yes, sir," he smiled, tearing a piece of his breakfast toast to share with a tabby cat. My grandmother says looking after others brings good luck, even if they're just cats. Your grandmother sounds wise, the businessman replied, thinking carefully about his next words. Would you mind if we talked for a few minutes? I have something important to discuss with you. They sat on a nearby bench, the morning traffic humming in the background. The businessman noticed how the boy sat straight, attentive but not nervous, showing a maturity beyond his years. I'm going to be direct with you, the businessman began. My wife told me about your kindness on the bus last week. It got me thinking about how one small action can change everything. He paused, watching the boy's reaction. I've learned a bit about you, your excellent grades, your help at the community center, your dream of becoming a doctor. The boy listened quietly, his hands folded in his lap. The businessman continued, I'm not here to offer charity. I'm here to make an investment. In you, in your future, and in your community. He explained his proposal. A college fund for the boy's medical school dreams, immediate assistance for his grandmother's medical bills, and a community initiative to reinstate the canceled bus route. But here's the thing, he added, this isn't a handout. It's a partnership. The boy's eyes widened slightly, but he remained composed. What kind of partnership, sir? The kind where you keep doing exactly what you're doing. Studying hard, helping others, making your community better. In return, my company will provide the resources you need to achieve your dreams. We'll also work together to help other kids like you who just need a chance. The businessman watched as the boy processed this information. He could see wheels turning behind those young eyes, considering not just the opportunity but the responsibility it carried. My grandmother, the boy started, his voice steady but concerned, she works so hard. Would this help make things easier for her? The businessman's heart warmed at the question. Even in this moment, the boy's first thought was for others. Yes, it would. We can help her find a better paying job with one shift instead of two, with full health benefits. The boy looked down at his worn backpack, then at the cats still lingering nearby, then back at the businessman. I don't want people to think I'm different or special, he said finally. There are other kids who need help too. That's exactly why I want to work with you, the businessman smiled. Together, we can help more people. Your kindness inspired my wife, who inspired me, and now we can inspire others. That's how good things grow. They spent the next few minutes discussing details, the boy asking surprisingly thoughtful questions about how the community program would work. The businessman explained how they could set up tutoring programs, health clinics, and job training workshops in the neighborhood. As their bus approached, the boy stood up, shouldering his backpack. Sir, he said with a small smile, my grandmother also says that when good fortune comes, you should accept it with grace and share it with others. The businessman extended his hand, and the boy shook it firmly. In that handshake was a promise, not just of help received, but of help to be passed on to others. The changes happened gradually at first, like ripples spreading across a pond. Within weeks, the boy's grandmother started her new job at the businessman's company, a single shift with better pay and full benefits. Her proud smile when she received her first paycheck lit up the whole office. The local news caught wind of the story, not just about the boy and the businessman, but about how their partnership was transforming the neighborhood. The headline read, "A bus ride that changed a community," but that was just the beginning. The businessman's wife helped set up a small health clinic in the community center where the boy volunteered. Now, instead of just tutoring younger kids, he got to watch real doctors at work. The doctors noticed how the younger children listened to him, how he could explain complex medical terms in ways they understood. You've got a natural gift, one doctor told him after watching him calm a nervous young patient. You'll make an excellent physician someday. The boy had blushed but stood a little taller, his dream feeling more real with each passing day. The canceled bus route was reinstated, but the boy still chose to walk sometimes, especially on sunny mornings. The stray cats had a proper feeding station now, maintained by a group of neighborhood kids who'd been inspired by his example. Even the grumpy old man who lived next to the bus stop started leaving out water bowls for the cats. His grandmother's arthritis improved with proper medical care, and she started teaching cooking classes at the community center. My grandmother's special recipe, the boy would proudly tell anyone who asked about the delicious smells wafting from the kitchen. The cooking classes brought together people who'd lived as neighbors for years but had never really talked before. The businessman didn't just write checks. He showed up. He attended community meetings, listened to concerns, and worked with local leaders to address problems. His wife, now with a healthy baby, brought their newborn to these meetings, saying she wanted their child to grow up understanding the importance of community. But the most remarkable changes were the small ones. Other kids started staying after school to help clean up classrooms. The local library had a waiting list for medical books. Neighbors began greeting each other by name, sharing meals, watching out for each other's children. The boy's grades stayed excellent, but now he had proper tools to study with. A laptop for research, new textbooks without missing pages, and a quiet place at the community center to study when his grandmother worked late. Yet he remained the same kind, humble person who'd given up his seat that fateful morning. Word spread to other neighborhoods. People wanted to know how one bus ride had sparked such change. The businessman found himself invited to speak at city council meetings, sharing the story and encouraging other successful people to invest in their communities. It's not about handouts, he would explain. It's about recognizing potential and building bridges. Sometimes all people need is a chance. The local newspaper ran a follow-up story about the neighborhood's transformation. They interviewed the bus driver who'd witnessed that first act of kindness. That morning, when the boy offered his seat, "I had no idea I was watching the beginning of something so big," he said. Goes to show you never know which small kindness might change everything. The boy kept his promise too. Every chance he got, he looked for ways to help others. He started a mentoring program for younger students, sharing study tips and encouragement. Everyone has something to give, he'd tell them, even if it's just a seat on the bus. One evening, as the boy and his grandmother walked home from the community center, they passed the bus stop where it all began. The evening sun painted the sky orange, and the cats lounged peacefully in their new feeding station. His grandmother squeezed his hand and said softly, "You know, sometimes the biggest blessings come from the smallest acts of kindness." 5 years passed in what felt like the blink of an eye. The morning sun streamed through the windows of the high school auditorium, where families gathered for graduation day. The boy, now a young man, stood at the podium as valedictorian, looking out at the sea of faces before him. In the front row sat his grandmother, tears of joy streaming down her face. Next to her were the businessman and his wife, their young child fidgeting excitedly in a tiny suit. The businessman's company had grown, but he never missed a community meeting or a chance to mentor promising students. The young man adjusted the microphone, his valedictory medal catching the sunlight. His voice, deeper now, but still carrying that same gentle kindness, filled the auditorium. 5 years ago, he began, I gave up my seat on a bus. It was such a small thing. Something my grandmother had taught me to do without thinking. I didn't know then that such a simple action would change not just my life, but the lives of so many others. He paused, looking at his grandmother, remembering those early morning walks to the bus stop. My grandmother always said that kindness comes back to you in unexpected ways. But what I've learned is that kindness does more than come back. It grows, it spreads, it transforms. The audience listened intently as he continued. That one morning led to opportunities I could hardly imagine. But the greatest gift wasn't the college fund, or the clinic, or even the restored bus route. The greatest gift was seeing how one small act of kindness could inspire others to be kind too. He spoke about the changes in their neighborhood, how the community center now offered free medical checkups, how local businesses had started apprenticeship programs, how the stray cats had become beloved neighborhood mascots with their own Instagram account run by local kids. But here's what matters most, he said, his voice growing stronger. Every person in this room has the power to start something amazing. You don't need money or status. You just need to be willing to help someone else, even in the smallest way. The businessman's wife dabbed at her eyes, remembering that morning on the bus. Her child, now old enough to understand, listened with wide eyes as the young man described how their families had become intertwined through that chance encounter. As I head to medical school this fall, the young man continued, I carry with me every lesson learned from these past 5 years. I've learned that true success isn't just about achieving your own dreams. It's about helping others achieve theirs too. He looked at the businessman, who nodded encouragingly. I've learned that wealth isn't just about money. It's about the richness of community, the wealth of kindness, the abundance of hope we create when we help each other. The young man's voice softened as he reached his conclusion. So, as we graduate today, I want to share my grandmother's wisdom with all of you. Sometimes the right thing and the hard thing are the same thing. Sometimes the smallest kindness can change everything. And always, always remember that we rise by lifting others. As he finished speaking, the auditorium erupted in applause. His grandmother stood up, clapping through her tears. The businessman's child bounced excitedly, waving a small hand-drawn sign that read, Our Hero. Later, as families gathered outside for photos, the businessman overheard the young man talking to a group of younger students. He was explaining how they too could apply for the community scholarship program, encouraging them to volunteer at the clinic, sharing his dream of coming back after medical school to serve their neighborhood. The morning sun painted everything in a golden light, much like that day on the bus 5 years ago. Sometimes the biggest changes start with the smallest choices, like giving up a seat, sharing a sandwich, or simply believing in the power of kindness to transform lives.